Today I want to talk about rights of nature. I don't know about you all, but 2020 and 2021 has me seeking solutions. And this is one that has definitely empowered me. And so I want to give a little background and talk about what exactly are rights of nature. But first, let's start with what is biodiversity. And if you're following Claire or me, you're probably kind of familiar with what biodiversity is. But just for background, variety of life, everything, nature, we consider it biodiversity. It's the genetic, the species, and the ecosystem diversity, variety that it exists within our small blue planet. And then why is biodiversity important? Well, variety is the engine of evolution. And we talked about this a little bit a couple weeks ago when we talked about the banana. But without variety in genes and in species and in ecosystems, we wouldn't have evolution, and life would be very different, cease to exist. And biodiversity is important on a practical note for human life, something that's important to us. We get our medicines, our fibers, our food, and our structure, our timber from biodiversity. And without it, we wouldn't have clean air, clean water, any of these ecosystem services that it provides. It's also really important to businesses. Something to note that I deal with that in my work, but 50% of businesses rely on underpinning biodiversity. So how do we protect biodiversity? If you're not familiar, biodiversity is in severe decline. The collapse of biodiversity is a similar issue to the climate crisis. They are intertwined, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But it can feel kind of devastating that our daily consumption is destroying the planet. So what do we do? Instead of focusing on the problem, I'd rather think, what are we doing about it? Some background on kind of the political structure that we're going to talk about here. Between 2010 and 2020, we had biodiversity targets in place called the Aichi targets, and they were set up to help us reduce the decline of biodiversity, but unfortunately they were deemed completely unsuccessful. And in 2012, IPBES was founded, and IPBES is the International Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. If you're at all familiar with climate, there is a similar organization called the IPCC. Both organizations compile scientific information and put out really important reports that then structure kind of how policy moves forward. In 2016, we had the Paris Climate Agreement. This has shaped quite a lot in the past 5 years for how things have moved forward. There is the target of 1.5 degrees Celsius warming that we do not want to pass, which allows businesses, countries, cities, etc., to really set targets on their carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. In 2019, IPBES, this science organization that I described before, put out kind of a devastating global biodiversity assessment. You might have remembered headlines from a couple of years ago saying 1 million species are at risk of extinction. That came out of this IPBES report. And they called in this report for transformational change. They basically said that without transformational change, within 50 years, we are going to see the collapse of life on Earth as we know it. So no big deal, but kind of a big deal. So what are we doing about it? Well, first we need the background knowledge, which, we're lucky that I think it was something like 200 scientists came together, compiled all the evidence that is available, that is out there to create that report. They also came up with a lot of solutions. And from those solutions came the Leaders Pledge for Nature, which so far about 85 countries have signed on to. And this was in September 2020. From there, the Leaders Pledge will hopefully morph into the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We see this Global Biodiversity Framework as being the answer to the Paris Climate Agreement, but instead for nature. And there, with the framework, there'll be like monitoring, evaluation, these types of things built in to ensure efficacy, because what happened with the Aichi targets, what we can learn from the failure of those targets is that they didn't consider how these targets would be measured and monitored when they derived them. So now when we derive the Global Biodiversity Framework, we need to consider how targets are going to be validated, accounted for, measured, and monitored. So when do we get this post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework? And hopefully, what does it provide? Well, hopefully it provides us transformative change needed to protect nature, and it's monitorable and measurable and verifiable. And I like this graphic because it kind of shows us, you know, the global natural capital accountability system. So how do we account for all of these kind of intangible things, all of what nature provides us, also known as kind of the global commons. If you've heard of tragedy of the commons, we're sort of in that situation right now where there's no accountability system built. And so therefore kind of people take whatever they want. But this is changing. As we're seeing with accountability for carbon emissions, disclosures for carbon emissions being voluntary, and then those voluntary carbon emissions disclosures becoming mandatory in countries like the UK and New Zealand, which is great news. We want mandatory disclosures. So we have the financial impact metrics that companies have to use, mostly about money, but they're starting to account for other things besides money, these intangible things that truly are tangible. We have science-based targets. So using science, using these reports to come up with targets. And what's kind of fun is that there are two networks. There's the Science-Based Targets Network for nature and also for climate. And the Science-Based Targets Network that's setting nature-based targets is using that IPBES report as the structure for how to build the targets, and companies are setting these. So on the right side for climate, we have the nationally determined contributions, NDCs. Part of the Paris Climate Agreement is that each and every country has to do its fair share. So they basically allocated amount of reduction for each country. And so what we hope is we get a similar thing for the Global Biodiversity Framework. We have nature disclosures and carbon disclosures, ecosystem services credits, and carbon credits. And this is really like the crux of the solution that we see going forward for accounting for these things. But when will the Global Biodiversity Framework come into action? That's going to be in October 2021. So this year, it was supposed to be October 2020 and it got pushed back. And then it was supposed to be May 2020 and then 2021 and it got pushed back again. And now we're looking at October 2021 in Kunming, China, for all the parties of the Convention of Biological Diversity. That's the UN convention that hosts this summit, to come together to finalize the Global Biodiversity Framework and the monitoring and verification frameworks that go along with it. So it's very exciting. But what does this have to do with rights of nature? Well, that is one component of the Global Biodiversity Framework that some groups are lobbying for. And a common misconception is that nature needs protected places without any people. But truly, that IPBES report in 2019 that I keep bringing up was a big, important report, obviously, reminded us that 85% of intact nature is taken care of by indigenous peoples. It's not nature with no people in there. And a recent study came out in just a couple weeks ago that also reminded us that people have been shaping most of terrestrial nature for at least 12,000 years. And this is something that Claire and I really like to talk about, which is that we are not separate from nature. Humans can have an incredible impact if we consider ourselves the gardeners of nature. Just like we garden in our backyard, we can kind of bring that mindset into our daily lives and consider how our actions are gardening the greater world. And this is truly a transformation that we need to have within ourselves and our mindset in order to prevent the decline of biodiversity moving forward. And so right now we're really disconnected to what it means to care for the land. I'm sure we're all feeling that way, especially these days, being more stuck in our houses. Some of you maybe not as much with your vaccines, but me for sure. So we know that humans have rights. Maybe they're not always super well protected all over the world, but we generally have them. Companies have rights. So if you're wondering how nature could possibly have rights, just imagine companies do have rights. So it is not unheard of for nature to always also have rights. So why shouldn't nature have rights? How does it work? Well, I think it's nice to highlight a few examples here. Ecuador has an ecological constitution. They were the first to pass kind of a rights of nature kind of full legislation. So basically Ecuador rewrote a lot of its constitution in 2008 to provide rights to Mother Earth. That's kind of how it's written. And that means that before ecosystems are changed or rivers are the structure or downstream a river changes, there needs to be what's called a tribunal to come together and ensure that this is good for nature and for people. Chile recently also passed an ecological constitution. And why these ecological constitutions are especially important is because they set incredible precedents for other, for example, getting rights of nature into the global biodiversity framework. When we have really strong examples of other pieces of legislation that have been passed that provide nature rights, we can use those and the successful stories that come from them. So with Ecuador having successfully implemented an ecological constitution and now having 12 years of experience of implementing it, it provides a really incredible precedent to draw on. And that is kind of how we got to the ecological constitution in Chile recently. And now that there's multiple, Bolivia also, we can see that these precedents are working and they're applicable in many circumstances. Australia has rights of nature for the Yarra River. It's seen as a living being, and before any changes are made that impact the river, there's a local community input from Indigenous communities. Same thing in New Zealand with the Wanagri River. I'm sorry about that pronunciation. But I think these are like there are many, many, many more examples. And I really suggest that if this is something that you're interested in, to kind of explore it. And we have it's kind of a special time because this framework has been pushed back. What we can do right now is sort of educate ourselves and start to see ourselves as gardeners and understand what it might look like if we provided nature with rights, and then actually like use our time on Instagram or Twitter or talking at the dinner table to talk about these things. to kind of understand what they could mean and try to mainstream it into our lives a little bit. Because this is still an open lobbying discussion for the global biodiversity framework. Like we're in the phase now where we can still have influence on what happens there, which I think is pretty exciting. And so, yes, if you want to learn more, I have definitely follow COP15. COP26 is the climate convening of the parties. That's what COP stands for. That's happening in Glasgow, Scotland this summer. And COP15 is for the Convention of Biological Diversity in Kunming, China in October. And that's where we have the opportunity to push for the rights of nature being a part of the global biodiversity framework. Rights of river is, there's a universal declaration of the rights of river that you can sign on to. Right now, they've also been doing in 2021 European tribunals in defense of aquatic ecosystems. There's also the Earth Law Center in the US, which has been kind of compiling a lot of these precedents and helping with some of the legislation. If you go to the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, they have this interactive map where you can check out different policies that exist to provide nature rights. And also, this is one of my favorite Instagram pages. You can follow them at _rights of nature, and they show you all different examples kind of related to this map, and a lot of nice educational things there. So yeah, that's all from me for now. I can stop sharing.
Great. Louisa, thank you so much. That was really a wonderful overview. I'm going to watch it again. I'll be sharing this presentation and conversation on YouTube and on Instagram, so we can all reference back everything that we just learned. There is a question from Barry, and he asks, why do you think that South America is so far ahead of the curve on legislation?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I don't know if you remember, but it was like, I think the ecological constitution in Ecuador passed this past November, or maybe earlier. One thing I know for sure is that there was a lot of people in the streets asking for this. So definitely organizing. I also think kind of this concept of Mother Nature is more in touch with people in South America who haven't like lost their connection to land in the same way that a lot of people from colonizing backgrounds have. And I think that's something important for us to realize. Like, we're all you know, either ripped from our ecosystem, a lot of us are ripped from our ecosystems or have left ecosystems, and when we are more connected to our ecosystems, we might feel differently. That's just my personal assumptions, but yeah, take what you will.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in South America, and I think that it still influences my artwork, I mean, clearly. And it's interesting, I got a comment, I forget when it was, but I was talking about my interest in biodiversity, and they were like, yeah, but it's really strange and unusual that you're into biodiversity. And I mean, yes, I realize that I'm sort of in this, you know, like little microcosm where I'm surrounded by people that love biodiversity and get just as excited about it as I do. But at the same time, I find it such a bizarre comment because, I mean, we are breathing air, we're drinking water, we're eating food grown from the earth. Everything that brings us joy, happiness, and just the right to exist is because of biodiversity. Without it, we have nothing. And I think the fact that I get these questions shows that there definitely is this disconnect, that people have forgotten where life comes from and originates and what it actually means. You know, to exist on this planet.
It happens with our food too, right? Where, we talked about the banana recently, and a lot of our food crops also originate in Central and South America. The potato, the tomato, the pineapple, a lot of food comes from there. And I think it's a similar like connection type of aspect there to
Yeah.
and how how we're connected to our ecosystems and the services that the ecosystems provide us. And from a business sense, we're trying to quantify that, to get people to protect it. But I also think it's equally as important to really shift our mindsets and think of ourselves as intertwined. It's not easy, but it's important.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it was interesting in your last talk. I had this realization. I was like, I've forgotten that food doesn't come from grocery stores, right? Like uh, it's easy that everything is so fragmented and compartmentalized that one forgets sort of the interconnectedness of everything. There's a comment from Barry. Again, I'm not sure if it's a question. It just says remnants of Darwin research question mark. Do you know what that means?
So very. I think Darwin was inspired by the nature there. And I think, like we said, that, humans have been gardening nature for at least 12,000 years. I think what he saw when he went to the islands and all of that was like, oh, wow, like this is what intact ecosystems look like. Because in Europe, what happened is when we're doing biodiversity work in Europe, we call it like human dominated landscapes, where I live currently in the Netherlands. And you basically just see like man-made things everywhere. And I think, people in other parts of the world who have prioritized this kind of ecosystem connection inspired Darwin rather than the other way around. But again, my opinion, so take what you want out of it.
Yeah, I actually, something that I wanted to bring up today in this conversation, and really thinking about a mind shift, right? Sort of moving away from the logistics and the legal framework, but about thinking about nature in a different way. I attended a really beautiful online event with the Sierra Club and the Women's Center, Women's Environmental Group, I believe, WEM. And there was a member of the Cherokee Nation. She's the keeper of the Tar Creek. And she was talking about Tar Creek is very, very polluted. And she sort of took on this role of being the keeper of this creek, the protector of this creek. And she was talking about the creek, and she was saying, the creek is wounded, she is bleeding, she needs our help, right? And it wasn't that she was, personifying the river, the creek. She was really talking about it as a living, sentient being. And I know that from my experiences in nature, I do see rivers, creeks, mountains, ecosystems as living beings that of course deserve rights. And I do, I hope through my art to talk about this, sort of the sacredness of living things that are non-human, right? Like sort of this expansion of empathy to non-human entities, I think is also part of the puzzle, right? I mean, you can get there with law, but I think that the law, I think that the idea of human rights, the idea that humans inherently deserve certain things, like I think that that came before the law, right? Like the law is born out of that belief, which is it's born out of a way of seeing and understanding the world. And I just hope that that there's a shift in the way that we see and understand the world to make space for this. There's a question that just came in from Clara. Are there any parts of the United States where you have seen large communities protecting and respecting biodiversity? Or is this exclusive to South and Central America?
It's definitely non-exclusive. And there is an example on that Instagram account that I showed in Wisconsin, where a Native American community is protecting, I think, a river. There's also, so I didn't really go into this, but nature-based solutions are kind of in the middle of that Venn diagram that I described as well. And that's when you use nature, when you utilize nature as a solution for both climate and biodiversity. And what we're seeing now is some really innovative projects with carbon credits, where I think we talked about this also in one of our first talks, where people, especially Native American communities, are being paid to protect forests and these type of or other waterways, and getting paid for those ecosystem service credits or carbon sequestration credits. So it's definitely expanding beyond South America. But what was unique about those South American examples is that they've actually, beyond having a single precedent of a single project or activity, they've gone beyond that and actually written this into their constitution, which, as you can imagine, is a huge step. And so that's really the type of step. So if the global biodiversity framework is like the constitution for nature for the world, then like writing this in would be pretty exciting.
I would also add that there's a lot of, I mean, this is what I've been following myself, is that there's a lot of activism going on against the pipelines being built through indigenous territory in the United States. Stop Line 3 is, you can follow that as a hashtag on social media, or just look up Line 3. And that's being built through indigenous territory. It shouldn't be allowed to be built. It's really quite a travesty of both nature and indigenous rights. And it's going to be built underneath the Mississippi River. And as we know about pipelines, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when it leaks and contaminates the water. And that's really the rallying cry of the groups trying to stop these pipelines, is that they're water protectors. And yeah, so I actually see the United States, like the indigenous groups of the United States, being fierce protectors of the rights of nature, and really at the front lines of this work. Yeah.
Just like, so imagine we had rights of nature written into the US Constitution, for example. How would that work? They wouldn't, in order for the companies to get the right permits, they would need to have tribunals of the community of water protectors to sign off. And right now it's not like that. And so they can be exploited, and it's,
that I would really recommend folks to look into that, because that's local. They also, I mean, the tribes that are doing this have basically been like, if you can, join us, like put your bodies in between us and the tractors. It's tar sands oil that's going to be pumped through those lines, and that's incredibly carbon intensive. I read somewhere, and I don't quote me on this, but I read that if these projects go through, they will tip us past the 1.5. It's really like it's an existential threat, these pipelines, both to the livelihoods of everyone that's relying on the Mississippi River and all of the ecosystems, but also just in terms of how far climate change is going to go. And yeah, so I would say, supporting those people doing that frontline work. I think that if anything, if I've learned anything this past year, it's that those voices, the indigenous voices that I follow in the United States, they're the ones that are really closest to this problem, and they're the ones putting their bodies between, like, really doing really brave work, actually living on resistant camps and things like that. Actually stopping the bulldozers and the tractors. Another thing that's just to highlight the attention to is, it's sort of interesting that this sort of like raping of the land goes along with a lot of abuse against women in these indigenous communities. So there's it's really a huge problem of missing and murdered indigenous women, and the rate of missing and indigenous women just explodes when there's drilling. The drilling, company brings in basically worker camps, almost all male, and no representation from the indigenous community. And it's really, really, really terrible. It creates this sort of second crisis, in addition to the environmental crisis of violence against women. So yeah, I think the question of, is it going on in the States? It really, really is. There's a lot happening and a lot to support, and really great people doing the work. Yeah.
Exactly. I think that again, it's kind of like shifting our mindset and understanding that when like there's something wrong with the health of an ecosystem, then that leads to the like health and well-being of the people around it very suffering. And that's kind of what we're, yeah, what we hope to avoid, and getting to nature positive eventually, 2030 to 2050, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, I could talk about this all day, but does anyone else have any questions for Louisa? I You can think about it for a second. I just wanted to say that I'm going to be posting a lot about this together with Louisa in the lead up to COP15. And yeah, I just think that this is something that's on my mind, and I would really like to normalize talking about this. Actually, I had a really funny, I got a message from someone on Instagram, and he was like, I think I can feel the trees getting cut down. He's in Canada, and there's a lot of logging of old growth forests happening near him, and he's just in anguish about it. But I feel like it's not normalized to talk about this, like non-human empathy, but I'm just, I am all for normalizing it. Like if we are hurting nature, it is hurting us. We should absolutely feel it. It's okay to feel it. And then it's, you know, great to organize around that feeling. And Sarah asks, what's the best way to get involved once we have educated ourselves, in addition to talking about it and raising awareness?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, you know, I avoid telling people that we all have an individual contribution to the problem. There's very little we can do with our own consumption unless we are very wealthy. If you are very wealthy, you can do a lot with your own consumption. But if you know, you worry about paychecks and day-to-day expenses, this is not for you to kind of push. But I think we're in the phase right now where we need to, I would just say, like, make your voice heard. If social media is the best way to do that, then that's fair. But there are people right now in negotiations trying to push rights of nature into this global biodiversity framework. It's not going to be easy. I will not lie. This is definitely an uphill battle, but making this global biodiversity framework as ambitious as possible is really the objective here. So I would say educating ourselves on that process, because I didn't, in 2016, before the Paris climate agreements, I was not involved in understanding what's happening, what's going on here. I was not in the know, but had I been, maybe I would have pushed maybe for soil carbon to be more of an emphasis in Paris agreements. And I think we have an opportunity here to make our voices heard a little bit, but I really think right now spreading awareness, it's a niche topic. This is incredibly niche. And I think for the next few years, what we can really do is that awareness piece, like what Claire said, supporting the indigenous activists with your body, if you're able, is really like top tier activism and support in this area.
Yeah, I told my mom that maybe our next vacation together can just be at a resistance camp, right? Like just like go and spend 2 weeks at a resistance camp. I honestly can't think of anything more than I would want to do with my mother once I'm vaccinated. And another thing that just another action, like again, I would really recommend like joining a local organizing group, like, you know, see if maybe there's a local chapter of Fridays for Future, or I don't know, Sierra Club, NRDC, or you know, Extinction Rebellion. Just find a group that you feel like you mesh with, because I think connecting with a community around this is super powerful. And it also, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Like it exists, it's out there. Another thing is I just finally opened up my my ethical banking account today, because if you look at who's financing these fossil fuel infrastructure projects that are really violating the rights of nature, they're the major banks, right? Citibank, I'm looking at this, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, JP Morgan, Trust, Chase is up there, and also Deutsche Bank. So, and these, you know, when you're funding a project like this, you're funding genocide and ecocide, right? It's completely unacceptable. So I think that divesting from, like, I think divesting financially from these institutions is really powerful. Divesting your consumption from organizations that don't respect the rights of nature. And another follow-up on that, I'm reading a book right now called Sacred Instructions by Sherry Mitchell, who's a member of the Penobscot Nation. And she talks about like her forms of activism, and she talks about the importance of divestment, right? Like divest your energy from the way of being that you don't approve of, that's harmful, and then invest your energy into a vision of the world that you do approve of. So I think that, yeah, you know, taking out your money out of these bad banks is a great start, and then investing your energy into local organizing. I'm all about, you know, I'm kind of planning, I'm like, how can I, you know, tell Deutsche Bank that this isn't okay, right? Extinction Rebellion does great things. Yeah.
And if you really want to get involved, reach out to me because I am part of some lobbying groups for this.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. We're starting the rights of nature, love, the renaissance of the rights of nature.
COP15.
Yes. Okay, Louisa, it was, as always, a joy. Thanks for joining me in the garden. And I'm really excited to share this. And again, Louisa and I will be super active on, you know, social media in the coming weeks around this issue. And of course, if you have questions, you can reach out to me or Louisa, and we'll be happy to, you know, give tips or point you in the right direction. But yeah. Thank you, Louisa.
Hi, everybody.
Bye, everyone.